WCA, Mike Amori, how we doing? Week 2 update for the 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock group. I'm going to show you cats a game between Emerson with white and Jack K with the black pieces. The game begins with a Petrov defense or a Russian defense, and that in this position is when black, instead of protecting the pawn that's being attacked, plays a counterattack with the move knight f6, and that's what Jack K played. Here, white has some choices. The main move is to take the pawn, and from here you would get kicked by the move d6, and going back, there is another choice. If I'm playing white, I could just ignore it and just play like a 4 knights position. You guys know what I mean by that, right? So if black plays, for example, here, knight c6, we have a typical 4 knights game. In the game, Emerson goes for the pawn, and Jack correctly kicks the knight back. Just to show you guys, Rusa and I spent a long time during one camp analyzing this move. Knight takes f7, which is known as the Cochrane Gambit. And it's a real move. It looks absolutely crazy because you're only getting 2 pawns for the piece. But if the king takes the pawn, you have some issues with black. I mean, your king is kind of stuck for a while without any pawn cover. It's not that easy for white to crash through. A lot of players just instantly play d4, building a center. You really can't take this pawn with black. I mean, you can, but you're going to get hit with this queen h5 check, and white usually picks up this knight. But normally after d4, black will just try to develop the pieces. But, just showing you guys that this exists, just in case you wanted to play it. So here it is again. You're playing white, they kick it, and why not take a pawn and have some fun? So, you may want to try that out. But Emerson has none of that and just goes back home, which is the normal line. Jack collects his pawn. And here there's a bunch of ways for white to play. One of the main moves is to play d4 to put a pawn in the middle. Another way to play that I really like, especially for improving players like us, is to just play knight to c3 and challenge this beast on e4 just to see what black's going to do. And most players are not crazy about going back home, so they'll take your knight to double your pawns. And you can pause your video. What do you guys think here? How should white take back? Okay? In the opening, not always, but the majority of the time, we take away from the center because you see it opens up our dark squared bishop. And the main line from here could go bishop to e7, bishop e3, knight c6. These are all pretty standard developing moves, right? Queen to d2, bishop e6, and then the idea of castling long into the extra pawn. You guys see that? See these 4 pawns here? You have an extra pawn to protect the king. Whether or not black can take this pawn, be careful because the bishop could get mouse-trapped. And then the king will come to the square and try to collect the bishop before black can start trouble with these pawns, all right? Just pointing that little mousetrap out. Why? Because it comes up in this game. Very interesting. Yeah, keep your eye out for this. Let's go back. Emerson's knight got kicked. Jack takes, and Emerson tries the pin trick, pinning the knight to the king. Queen e7, breaking the pin. Pawn to d3, chasing the knight back home. And this is a funny case where both players, neither wants to take the other queen, yet you can't move your queen because they're both pinned. If you take black, they're going to develop the bishop. If you take white, they're going to develop the bishop. So Emerson just tells Jack, no, knight to c3. And there's a whole lot of ways to play here. Jack could just develop another piece, but he plays a move that could have got him in a little trouble. He played the move g6. Now, why am I saying it can get him into trouble? Because the queen here on e7, the fact that it's pinned, could get hit with this knight to d5 at some point. And I know you're saying, no, that's crazy. There's a knight here on f6. But that knight gets pinned instantly. And here I think Jack should have traded queens right away. Just trade the queens, take back here, and now continue with bishop to g7, so that this knight is not pinned. You see that the bishop and knight, there's no longer a pin to the e7 square, right? I think this would have gotten Jack a very equal position, but watch very carefully, my friends, what happens here. There's the pin, right? He plays bishop to g7. The game is over, believe it or not. And the game didn't end here because Emerson missed the tactic. Really important that you look at every attacking move. Can you guys find the winning combination for white? Stop your video, spend a little time on this, pause it, and come back to me when you're done. I'll be here waiting. Okay, I actually did really take a sip of tea while you were pausing the video. The winning maneuver here is simply just take the queen, check. The king has to take, and now this really strong knight check. The knight on f6, you'll notice, is pinned here, and the problem for black, for Jack here, is this knight has two threats. It's attacking this knight, and it's also attacking the c7 square. There's no way out of this. Black is busted. If you protect that pawn, you're just going to lose a piece here. And this is really, really bad news. Probably going back after king d8. What am I saying? You should take with the bishop. Give me a new variation there. Yeah, just take with the bishop. Check. This is forced, and now take with the knight. This way you can't trap the knight or the bishop, and white is just up a whole pizza. But Emerson missed it, and that's why you should really, be real careful with these tactics. So what happened was, after bishop g7, he played knight to e4, but the problem here is there isn't the same pressure, and you cannot trade the queens like you could before. Game is completely equal. Maybe bishop to e6 for black now looks pretty good, but Jack castles, still fine, and Emerson does some trading. Knight takes check, bishop takes, queen takes e7, bishop takes, and it looks like black is down a piece, but you should all see how black gets his piece back. Rook to e8, and Emerson here can't save the bishop, so he simply castles long. I have another suggestion for the king. What do you guys think? Pause the video again. Excellent, James R. You're the one who got it first. Why not king d2? Because we're kind of creeping into an endgame here. The king is more than comfortable on the d2 square. Nothing's going to attack him anytime soon, right? The whole idea was if you castle long, you're on c1. If you play king d2, you're one step closer to the center. You might say, well, what's the big deal? It's one step. But if you get into an endgame where there's a king and pawn ending and a race between pawns and kings, that one tempo is huge. Plus, with the king on d2, you can immediately challenge the e-file with this rook. You guys see that idea? So Emerson castles instead, rook takes, and now plays d4. Game is still equal. d5. And this could be a game between two masters at this point. It's really equalized itself. Bishop to d3, developing, connecting the rooks, knight to c6. I love Emerson's next move, rook h to e1. These guys are playing really well. Rook takes, rook takes. So if anything, white has control of this file, but there really isn't a whole lot to do here. There's very, very little that that white can do. Maybe in positions like this, guys, you can think about a pawn move, f6, and you'll notice that with the pawn here, all of the squares here, let me highlight them for you, are covered. You could get checked, but the king will just come to f7, and there's nothing this rook can do up here. So, I don't know, something to consider if you wanted to play that way, but in the game, bishop to g4, pinning the knight. Emerson says no, puts it in the middle. the bishop retreats. And this was a little funky square for the bishop. So I want you guys to go back to this position and try to understand that, taking the knight here may have been a little more natural. Say the pawn takes back, because the freedom that this bishop has, and this pawn really isn't that scary right now. You have a nice blockading square for the bishop. You can put your rook underneath, start bringing your king out. I think the game is so equal, probably end in a draw. But what Jack did here, he took a little bit of a risk with bishop h5, because it's kind of trapped by his own pawns. And I think Emerson move knight takes, pawn takes allowed the move rook to e7, which is really strong. And white is pressing first. You guys know what I mean by that, right? The rook is on the 7th rank, attacking a pawn. Could have protected it. I'm not sure. Maybe he was afraid of like bishop a6, and I think the complications favor white here. Instead, he just ditches the pawn. He plays bishop to g4, trying to get that piece back in the game, but kind of too late now because of rook takes c7. Too active. He did it to trade rooks, which, I don't think Emerson wants to trade at this point, especially since there's another pawn to grab. And the problem for black is he's too slow. White's counterplay and attack already came first. Pawn takes, rook takes, now c3. d4, trying to take advantage of the pin. The rook protects. And here, bishop to e6, attacking the a pawn. Rook takes, bishop takes. Aha! You guys remember that mousetrap I was talking about before? Pause your video. You remember this? You see where the bishop is on a2? All right, let's go back to our game. You remember where the bishop is in Jack and Emerson's game? It's on a2. There it is, the same square. Watch the mousetrap. King c2. Rook g5, attacking a pawn. b3, trapping the bishop. There it is, the mousetrap in action. Rook takes g2. Rook f4. Emerson does not want to lose this pawn with a check. Pawn to g5. Rook f5. Rook takes h2, allows rook takes g5 check. King makes a run for it. The rook comes back to protect the h-pawn. h5. Now, black is lost in this position. However, Jack didn't resign. Let me show you why. King b2, the bishop is lost. So you might as well take a pawn. You're going to lose the bishop anyway. He played rook h3. Bishop goes to e2, h4. Bishop g4 attacking the rook. Rook goes to d3. We finally take the bishop. Rook takes the c-pawn. Watch this, my friends. King a3, h3, rook behind the pawn. So that pawn's a goner. Rook c2, rook takes on h3, rook takes on f2. The extra bishop is enough to win because this pawn is going to be so hard to stop that Jack is going to have to give up his rook for that pawn. However, Emerson made a very careless move here and got away with it. I mean, he's totally winning this position. He played king a4. Ah! What's wrong with that, my friends? I hope you don't miss it. Emerson, do those tactics, kid. Rook f4 check. Game is a complete draw. The bishop is lost. But fortunately, Jack missed it. So for Emerson, he got away with one here. So after king a4, he was given a check, but that's just going to drive the king to where he wants to go. Class ended in a little while, and we all agreed that white had a winning position, but he still has some work to do. Very well played, my friends. I'll put some notes in the blog. I hope you learned something. This is your own work. This is Mike Amori. I'll see you on Sunday.